but we're going to start right now because we're running a little bit late, but not too bad. My name's Don Williams. I work with a program called Broadband USA. That's part of the National Telecommunications Information Administration, which is a part of the Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. Hopefully not a member of the groupthink. Thanks for that, Chris. That was really nice. I provide technical assistance to communities across the country. We work with ISPs, cooperatives, pretty much anybody at all, and we try to work with them on business plans, technology choices, stakeholder engagement, sustainability efforts, planning efforts, RFPs, and evaluations of proposals that they get back. We've got a really nice panel here today, and we're going to talk about, we've had a lot of great talks about broadband's importance and broadband's importance in economic development, which is really my major focus. And one of the things that I know, and I think you all know, is networks are great, but you have to pay for them. And you have to pay for them not just in terms of capital cost, but you have to pay for them in terms of ongoing sustainability. And today we've got 4 folks who know quite a bit about different ways that networks can be financed depending on where you are. And I just want to do a very brief introduction. There's longer introductions that are in the back. Jim Baller sitting at the end. Jim and I have known each other for quite a few decades. And Jim is president of Baller, Stokes & Lide National Law Firm based in Washington. It's the only law firm in America to be included in the Broadband Community's Fiber to the Home Top 100 each of the last 6 years. Jim represents clients in a variety of broadband-related topics in 35 states. Garrett Brinker is the project manager for public finance and capital markets at the Neighborly Group. He leads product development and connecting communities to capital for world-positive projects such as municipal broadband, microgrids, and resilient infrastructure. Jonathan Chambers, who has joined us, and we are happy you're here, Jonathan. He's had a busy day and then some. He is partner in Connexon, former chief office of strategic planning and policy analysis for the Federal Communications Commission. Worked for over 30 years in startup companies with telecommunication. He was 4 years with the chief of office strategic planning for the Federal Communications Commission, and was part of the senior leadership that reformed the $12 billion in annual federal spending, including rural, high-cost fund, E-rate, and relay services. We also have Tom Coverick, and we've been on a number of panels together in the past, including ones in this very forum. Tom joined KeyBanc Capital in 2007. He leads the broadband public finance initiatives. He manages the Office of Public Finance in Illinois, Colorado, Indiana, New York, and Utah. He's got over 20 years in experience in this very field, and he's been the financial advisor for the issuance of over $10 billion in municipal bond offerings. So we have a great panel here today, and we're going to start out with some questions, and then we want to move into questions that you may have as well. My first question is going to be for Tom. Are there any financial models or plans of finance that have been emerging that municipal broadband sponsors have been leaning to, probably since the last time we talked about this, maybe 2 or 3 years ago?
So I get to answer the first question and wake everybody up. You know, one of the observations that I have about being on panels, particularly on this topic, at this point in the day, or any point in the day, quite honestly, is that over the past few years, there's more and more active participants in the audience as opposed to a few years ago when everybody gone through the day and listened to the need for networks, the drive for the networks, and then all of a sudden, when it comes time to pay for it, everybody's, you know, at cocktail hour, and it wasn't a concern. I think more and more there's a realization that in order to finance these networks, the municipal entities will need some form of initiative on their own in order to pay for these networks, in order to provide the capital markets. I know Garrett has a very different perspective, and that's great. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're on a panel together, is because there are very different ways to finance these networks. One size does not fit all. There aren't going to be any networks that are identical, and there aren't going to be any plans of finance that are identical. So I think to answer your question in a very long-winded way, at the end of the day, there are no, one-size-fits-all type of financing packages that are coming together. What is emerging in the public utility space is that those districts are lending their fiscal support and their creditworthiness to the offerings for the bonds in the capital markets. And so what's happening is they're simply saying, we're going to pledge our general fund just the way we would for our normal infrastructure projects. However, this is just a different type of infrastructure project. So long and short, I think that there is not one size fits all. I don't think that there's one type of program that's emerging, but in the public utility district world, there seems to be, especially in Colorado and the Northwest, there seems to be a lot of drive for utilizing the existing credit. And they're very strong. They're reliable credits to access the capital markets most efficiently as well as most economically.
Well, thank you. Jonathan, you've had a lot of experience in both federal projects and now working with rural electric co-ops for quite a while. And in Washington, we have a lot of discussion about what the appropriate role is of public funds in financing broadband infrastructure. I'm wondering if you could give us your general idea of what is the role of public funds, perhaps federal funds, in financing broadband infrastructure. I say this with a little background. We were in BTOP, and we did $4.2 billion worth of broadband infrastructure, including digital inclusion. Most successful, not all, but most.
Thanks.
Working?
So first, the source of funds. I work these days only with rural electric cooperatives who are building fiber to the premise networks. And those co-ops build their networks. Their source of funds is the same source of funds they've had over the past 80 years. They borrow from RUS, they borrow from KeyBanc, they borrow from CFC, and we've never had difficulty in raising funds through debt by borrowing from the traditional lenders to cooperatives. Now, your question about the role of public funds is, as traditionally electric co-ops have been funded since their inception just through borrowing from the government or from cooperative banks.
Right.
The telecommunications industry, much different, has largely been funded in rural areas by public funds, by subsidies mostly, not in the form of grants, but by ongoing subsidies that have gone on for decades. And today, between the FCC and RUS and various state programs, Pennsylvania has a program, the governments across the country are going to spend likely $50 to $60 billion of the public's money over the next decade. To me, the question is a combination of what does that money get spent on? And if any of you were in the panel earlier with me, you know I think that if you're going to spend the public's money, you ought to spend the public's money on long-term infrastructure. And whether it's today or last year or 10 years from ago or 10 years from now, that public infrastructure in the telecommunications industry is fiber. We should be building fiber optic networks with public funds. Now, the question of where those public funds go typically has to do with where private investment won't invest money. This isn't that difficult to figure out, and if Sasha's still in the room, you know, you can, as good or bad as maps are, the maps always look the same when it comes to infrastructure, because maps about infrastructure, telecommunications, electricity, water, anything, usually are maps of population density. They're just different ways of looking at population density. And population density teaches you that in telecommunications, cable and telephone companies generally don't build with their own money to population densities of fewer than 15 to 20 homes per mile. So the money should be directed where the public money should be directed to where private money won't go on its own. The disagreement I've had for years, not just while I was at the FCC, but going back to the early 1990s, since I've been engaged in these policy debates, and I agree with everything Sasha said about living and working in Washington. The disagreement I've had is that for most of the past 80 years, going back to the Kingsbury Commitment, public funds have been directed to just one type of company, one industry, over and over again. You can dress it up many different ways, but it always comes down to the same thing, which is politicians and the regulators decide just to give money to the telephone companies, not to give money to community institutions, to electric cooperatives, to other types of cooperatives. And finally, starting tomorrow, the FCC will commence an auction of public funds for those who would build infrastructure. And it's a nice beginning, but, a real but here, it's a $1.98 billion 10-year program over which time the FCC will spend $45 billion on the telephone industry. So, $2 billion for everybody and $43 billion for the telephone industry is a beginning, but it's not going to get us there until we get some system of the full ability of communities themselves making choices by what people will buy in the marketplace, by what local communities will build, getting access to federal funds in areas where private industry won't build. So that's my long-winded answer to your
No,
short
but it's a
question.
good one. We had discussions earlier about rural, and the federal government, I think, has about 36 definitions of rural. And depending on what grant program or loan program you're working on, you may think you're rural, but according to that program, you're not. Similarly, I hear people talk about, I work in a lot of different places in America, and I hear people talk about, as you said, 10 homes a mile. I work in places where we're counting up how many homes there are per square mile, which is not going to be 10 homes per mile. And you're absolutely right. We do need to put our money where things are not currently being served. And we're going to talk about some overbuild issues a little while. Jim, you're busting to cut in. Go for it.
When you asked the question about public funds, I think, John, you immediately assumed he was talking about federal funds subsidizing projects. Now, my background is in working with public entities, many of which were communities that electrified themselves 50 years before most of the cooperatives went into the world of electrification with REA funds. Sometimes and often we hear that spending by communities on their own projects is spending public funds. Often that is not the case because, like cooperatives, they borrow, they take loans, the loans are paid off over time, so they're like a commercial borrower, but the funds are not public funds as such. And to the extent you could consider those public funds, I would say that funds should be used as the community thinks they ought to be used. There's nobody better than local, responsible decision makers to decide what works in that community and what projects will most enhance the community's well-being. And if it were up to me, communities would make those choices free of barriers by states or the federal government or anybody else.
Good point, Jim. So when we talk about, and we're going to get another question right away to you. I just want to say, so that's right. So there's local funds that go into municipal projects, that go into various state infrastructure projects, and then there are federal funds that get distributed by either USDA programs, our old BTOP programs, FCC programs. There's HUD programs that do the same thing. There's a lot of different ways to think about public funds. And all of those are going to have various, this is why we call it political economics, right? There's politics involved in every single one of the way these funds are created and the way these funds are indeed distributed. Garrett, have a question for you, which is, what are the advantages and drawbacks of enabling local investment in broadband networks? Your company has a different way to think about that, and if you could run through it, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So just a bit of background. Neighborly, we focus on democratizing access to municipal bonds, and so really trying to build local pools of capital for these networks. And so what we believe in building municipal broadband networks and building community broadband networks is that the investment of local capital is an unbelievably powerful mechanism that can really serve the success of these networks. So first off, I think we talk about the disadvantages or the challenges in that. We often get asked what are the risks of local investment in these projects. First off is investor education. And so if you are, we've seen with our resident investors, about a third of them are first-time bond buyers. And so obviously with that hill to overcome, you need to ensure that those that are investing in public infrastructure projects and broadband networks actually understand what they're investing in. So you really need to build a platform, a library of information to ensure that not only residents understand what a community broadband network is, but they understand the financing mechanisms that are associated with it. And then also, you're seeing these big efforts, especially in Colorado and places like Fort Collins, if you're going to ensure local investment, you're going to have to do an incredible amount of investor outreach. And that means big marketing efforts by either larger consulting firms, or how we like to see it is in-house, and building a platform that can really be this full stack approach to both financing the network, but also ensuring that you can engage in local investor outreach. But if you build a platform, if you use software to actually create that investor outreach with a couple clicks of a button, you can ensure that you're hitting literally thousands of residents across that community. And so there are these challenges that you need to overcome in local investment, but the advantage of that is that if you can start to target residents locally in these communities that are investing in these broadband networks, and get them quite literally invested in the network, that they then have a vested interest in actually seeing the success of that network. And they're going to go to their neighbor, and they're going to go to their neighbor's neighbor, and you're going to have a ton of advocates or fiber champions, as I know Am in Idaho likes to call them, in your community that are serving as advocates for that network, and really have that belief and have that, again, vested interest in the success and the build out of the network.
So just a couple of questions. So you're not going to capital market participants for funding. You're going to individuals in the community.
You can go to both.
Okay.
And so you can go to the larger markets, working with institutional investors, but you can also, for say 10 to 15% of that build out or that investment, go to the local community and ensure that there is actually that connection, instead of all of that capital being pooled on Wall Street, that it's actually pooled on Main Street as well.
Okay. So if you're going to the Main Street option as part of the plan, does the local government, is that the backstop in case things don't work out?
It depends, and to get back to Tom's point, that it can be the backstop.
Okay.
But so you can focus on GO, or it could be a revenue bond as well. And so that's we discussed some double barrel approaches.
Okay.
But that's really dependent on the network.
Okay. I could talk about this more. Jim, one of the things I want to talk to you about, you've been involved in a lot of public-private partnerships, and they've certainly been a hot topic of the last several years. I've worked with a number of them doing technical assistance work, and I guess my opinion of them is when all is said and done, it's a contract. And the devil's always in the detail in the contract. And I'm wondering if you think there are significant differences between kind of generic types of public-private partnerships. So let's think about ones that are private sector led, ones that are government led, private sector supported, or a joint ownership model. And I'm thinking about risks versus community control. I know community control is an important issue for lots of folks, and so is the risk factor. If you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
That's a lot of ground to cover, and I would say that public-private partnerships are certainly popular these days, at least in the exploratory stages.
Correct.
And many of them are going forward where the community and private partners find the right blend of considerations that meets everybody's needs. Every project has a need to weigh risks, contributions, rewards, and figuring out how to do that is very different, and it's amazing how many different models are out there working at finding that right balance for that particular community. Let me give you some examples of how that works. We've mentioned Ammon. What's interesting about the Ammon model is that Ammon is going to the end users to fund part of the network, the laterals off the network that the city is creating, and a private partner there is operating the network. That's an interesting way to do things. Westminster, Maryland, for example, the city there built out the network. Ting Internet is building on top of the network to provide end user services. It has an exclusive to do that for a period of time, but when it reaches certain targets, the network will open up and others will provide service. There are Kentucky Wired. This is on a state level. Kentucky Wired, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, determined that it could use the money it spends for its public needs through all its state agencies and redirect that toward developing a statewide fiber network and almost pay for the network through that alone. And that became the foundation for a network deal with Macquarie Capital and its partners that has resulted in a statewide fiber build, or it's in the process of doing that. Lincoln, Nebraska, had a city that had lots of conduit developed over a period of time. It got to the point where it became economically viable for Allo, a private company, to come in and agree to build out the rest of the city. So there are many, many different projects. Cities come into it wanting as much control as possible, wanting to minimize their risks, wanting to minimize or maximize their rewards. The private sector entity has similar goals. And somehow, depending on who the local champions are, what local industries are, what the prospects are for community alone, for regional networks, there's an endless, rich variety of possibility that can end up in projects that work for everyone.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the things I've noticed, though, in all networks, whether it was back in the 80s, 90s, or at the moment, is the things that really drive the business plan are essentially density and penetration rates. And when you change those assumptions, or you get to add, if somebody contributes 10 or 20% equity to a project that you don't have to pay back, those can be very determinant in a successful network or not. Tom, we've talked in the past about private capital and their view towards funding community networks, public-private partnership networks. And I'm wanting to know if the view of these capital market participants has matured in the sense of their risk assessment when they look at municipal broadband projects.
Unfortunately, the answer is no. There are certain market participants that are coming up, but by and large, whether you look at the credit rating agencies or a lot of the institutional investors or even some of the commercial banks, they're just not there when it comes to absorbing standalone credit risk to municipal broadband. I guess the best way to illustrate that is to tell a little bit of a story. We underwrote a deal late in 2017, so about 6 months ago, with an entity that's an ongoing entity that basically, as soon as they get the money into their project fund, they are encumbering it. And so it's not like the money is sitting there. As soon as they get it in, there are subscriptions, there are people who are signing up, so the take rates are there. Fiber is lit, and they spend the money, and they deploy the fiber. They wanted to come back to market and refinance their existing debt. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to dilute their credit structure a little bit, because basically one of the metrics that we look at when we evaluate credit, whether it's on a commercial banking side or as an investor or even as a rating agency, is debt service coverage. So at the point where this agency was, they had well over 1 times debt service coverage. And what that means is for every dollar that they spend on debt service, they have more than that dollar in their hand at the end of the water flow of all of the expenses they have to pay. So they've got more than enough at the end of the day to pay for their debt service with the revenue that they had pledged, and it just so happens to be a tax on energies, franchise fees. Those franchise fees are a very strong credit, and the bond community will eat those up all day long. And so what they wanted to do was basically say, we've got a lot of coverage from our enterprise, from our system, from our network that's kicking off a lot of money, but we just can't borrow as much as we'd like to without diluting the coverage on the franchise fees. So at the end of the day, when we ran the numbers and we presented them to the rating agencies, as the network stood there when we went to sell the bonds, there was 90 cents on the dollar from the franchise fees to pay the debt service on the bonds. Well, none of us would buy that bond, because if we have a dollar that's due to us, we want that dollar. But what the agency said was, as we sit here today, even before we do any additional build on this network, we have over 2.25 times coverage. That means that for every dollar that's spent, there's an extra $1.25 there as a cushion. The rating agencies, when we went to them, we thought this is a great structure. We'll be able to get this deal done. There's plenty of coverage. One rating agency looked at us and said, we don't know how to rate this. We don't know if it's a corporate credit or if it's a municipal credit, so we're just not going to rate it. Another rating agency put it far into the junk bond category, and we were fortunate enough to be able to convince one of the rating agencies, because they got the joke, that it was at least investment grade. But any other type of transaction that has that type of revenue coverage, debt service coverage, would be well within the investment grade category. And so the moral of the story is the rating agencies, the investment community, the people that buy your bonds, the commercial banks that might lend to you, even though they might like your credit, they might only be able to go out 10 years. That's not going to really help your network when you're financing something as big and certainly as long-lived as broadband. And so the moral of the story is, it's just the market participants are not viewing this yet as a utility like the rest of us in the room view it.
Well, I am also sorry to hear that, but that's also been, I think, my experience as well. Garrett, communities that we work with at NTIA, we always stress stakeholder engagement, And we have a very big idea of stakeholders. It's a gigantic tent, and that also includes local providers that have assets in the area. When you go into communities, what steps are involved in getting the community to think about financing the network? Everybody wants to talk about, I need a gig, I want this is important. Getting them to actually think about financing the network is a little less exciting sometimes.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think how we think about it is that it's actually much larger than just financing the network. This is, I think when we talk to communities, that they say that, okay, now we're at the step about thinking about financing the network, and actually you've been thinking about financing the network this entire time. That this is so what we think about it is it's everything from community engagement to construction. And so it actually starts at the political advocacy level. That you're actually and so how we think about it is around this concept of demand aggregation. How can you at the beginning of this movement, which are political advocacy movements, start to map and multiply the demand that might exist within a community. And so you find those fiber champions, you find those local advocates who want these networks. And so then you eventually get to a point where you need to think about, are you going to need bonding authority? Will you need to create some sort of special purpose district? What is the structure that needs to be in place for that? And that gets you to the point of bond approval or some sort of vote. Once you get past that, you then think about the actual mapping of these local improvement districts. Getting back to Ammon, Ammon has LID 1, LID 2, LID 3 to actually map the demand within each one of these neighborhoods and then finance the network from there. And so through this community engagement process, through this demand aggregation process, a community is able to then understand the financing mix that may be available to them. And these advocates, these fiber champions are able to learn from others in other communities about, say, the federal programs that might exist, to grant programs to hook up the most vital infrastructure that might exist in a community, and then be able to bond for the rest of it. So what we actually see is that financing conversation is happening from the first time a community advocate starts to talk about building a network in their neighborhood, in their town, in their city, and goes all the way through to the point in which you actually say finance the network with whatever mechanism. And we believe that we have to be a part of it from the beginning to that point.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I just build on
Please,
it for a
yeah.
minute? I think Garrett's point is one that gets lost in discussions quite often at these conferences, because I think that the focus is on, the need for a network, the design of a network, but really, to Garrett's point, it's as important to pull your bond or your financing team together as soon as you decide that you're going to build a network or you're going to endeavor, because the last thing that anyone wants to do is be in the position that I know we've been in, I'm sure, many times with some of my colleagues here, is to get to a point where it's great, everybody wants it, but then all of a sudden, how do we pay for it? And you get in front of a city council that has no clue what's going on, other than that they know they have a good network design, and nobody knows how to pay for it. So an uninformed vote at a city council level tends to be a no vote. And so I think, to Garrett's point, it's very, very important that as you pull this project together, that you put the financing piece in parallel with your network design.
Now, Tom, that's a great point. No, Jim wants to chime in. I just want to say, when I was a consultant for 27 years on these various community builds, one of the key things I always thought was to bring the elected officials and major stakeholders along with you, so that there's not a lot of surprises, as well as managing the expectations of everybody. Jim?
Now, I agree with what everyone has just said, but I'd like to build on it a little bit. When you think about networks today, they are like electricity platforms and drivers of simultaneous progress in just about everything that's important to a community. That includes economic development, education, public safety, healthcare, environmental protection. You know, the list just goes on. And when you realize that there are champions in each of those areas, and you bring them on board early on, you have greatly increased your potential funding, because the federal government has lots of programs. The FCC has programs in education and healthcare. You have the Department of Labor with labor programs. You have USDA for a variety of programs, including telehealth and other things. Each of those areas is a source of potential funding, as is the private sector. When you get all of those people in a room talking about how a network can serve all of their interests, before long you have the table being levitated with the energy that can flow around that room. So I agree with all of you that getting the key stakeholders together early on and committed is a great way for a project to be successful.
Please.
Let me just, that is not exactly a flip side to the financing question, but it's to us, a fundamental piece of the financing question is what it's going to cost you to build a network, because all of the questions about who the users are going to be or what your take rates are going to be are all made easier if you're not overspending on the network in the first instance. I mention one thing just because it came up this morning. I received an email from a company that had an RFP out, as a community that had an RFP out that we responded to. And they'd asked us to adjust all of our costs for construction to raise it to a common point that all of the bidders in this RFP had put out. And for us, that was raising the cost of construction by 50%, 50. And, you know, we reran our model because they asked, but we haven't had the conversation with them of, like, well, what would be the point of that? I mean, I can always spend more money, and it's going to make the model worse. And if you can still make it work, okay, you know, maybe you go ahead with a project. But it's easier to raise money if you're spending wisely. It's easier to find financing if you are watching every single penny. When I said we build networks where the population density tends to be between 3 and 8 homes per mile, you can't do it unless you're watching every penny. If you're in a competitive situation and you're building somewhere where there's a cable operator or a telephone company that's at least providing some decent level of DSL service, you can't overspend on your network, or you won't be competitive when the inevitable competitive response comes. Yeah. So all of this, because I hear it more often than I'd like, there are a lot of you who are a consultant for a lot of years. I'm a consultant now, and I'm going to get into another line of business someday, because, I mean, who wants to be a consultant, really? I mean, you give your advice, people follow it, don't follow it. If you don't pay attention to cost, and there are plenty of cost models out there that are just like anything goes. Start with a model of a system that has been built already, that is successful already, that is profitable already, that looks somewhat like your community already, and then adopt that. There are plenty of those kind of models out there. Trust something that's already working and try to get your costs in line with what they've done. Mm-hmm. And start with that, I'd say, before you get your financing lined up, because the financing gets easier the better you do in the upfront planning.
And the other thing is, the incumbents don't have to obey open meetings rules.
No,
so
they do not.
The decisions that you guys all make are a lot different than the decisions that are made by the incumbents, because they make them behind closed doors. You have people who scour every meeting, minutes of every city council meeting. I've been to them. There's always those 4 or 5 people who stand up at every meeting and talk about every topic, and they're going to study that, and that's the stuff that gets picked up in the paper because there's this citizen that is concerned about this, and maybe a slow news week, and so the local press picks up stuff that your incumbent providers just don't have to deal with. So those political headwinds can be considerable as well.
I have one question, and before we open it up, I know we're running out of time, I've already been warned. A lot of the places that I'm currently working with, the real driving force for bringing broadband to that community or improving what is there, which is often DSL and not upgraded DSL, is economic development for the community. We're losing population. We have to go into the next town to a fast food restaurant to get our kids to be able to do their homework. So those economic development benefits of a network, how are people thinking about that in the finance community? How do you address that, in fact, this network is so important to the community that it has to be financed? I know there's a Community Reinvestment Act can help sometimes, the local bank, but how do we begin to quantify that? Because that's a big issue for all the economic development folks, is how do we quantify the economic benefits of putting in a broadband network? So anybody like to?
Yeah,
Please.
I think we're just starting to think about how we quantify it, but the way in which we frame it, which is thinking about it, it is the 21st century bridge. We're Neighborly is based in San Francisco. I live in San Francisco, and I look out to the Golden Gate Bridge every day. One of the most iconic structures that exists in this country. And in the early 1930s, the city banded together to finance and to build that bridge locally because they recognized the unbelievable value, the unbelievable amounts of economic prosperity and opportunity that iconic piece of infrastructure could create for the city of San Francisco and its surrounding areas. And bridges were built across the country for many, many decades that created similar amounts of jobs and economic opportunity and connected people in ways in which they were never previously connected. And in today's information-based economy, municipal broadband is something that is simply required. And it is the 21st century bridge that can create that economic opportunity from in cities as big and already well connected as San Francisco to small communities like Ammon, Idaho. And that's what's so powerful about it. And if you can think about it in that mental model, in that frame, it starts to become easier to think about how to quantify those benefits.
Don, I think you've put your finger on a very serious challenge for us. We've been tracking economic development studies and anecdotal evidence for many years. We have a web page on it. Chris tracks that as well. And we don't have powerful tools that can quantify externalities well enough yet. If we did, we could see the real value of networks, and we could have a conversation about whether investments in them, even if they don't return costs directly through end user fees, would be a worthwhile thing to do for the total value for the community. We're getting closer. There are more and more studies. There are studies that look at pieces of it, like increases in property values and increased efficiencies and all of that. But at the end of the day, networks still need to pay for themselves somehow. And so communities recognizing that they still have to pay for networks are using a variety of models to make the networks pay for themselves. Some, instead of back in the old days, when you and I got started in this stuff, communities would think of building out a whole community. That would be in their plan from the outset. Now, some communities are thinking about stepping into build-outs using revenues generated to pay in part for additional build-outs. There are a variety of other ways that communities are using, but at the end of the day, the networks still need to be paid for out of real money. And while we know that they are engines of economic development, while we know the community will benefit across the board, they still don't factor into the revenues directly, and we need to work on that.
Let me echo Jim's comments. And we've done about 75 business plans for electric co-ops around the country. We do not put economic development in. We do not put benefits from smart grid or downline SCADA or economic efficiencies. We don't put in better property values for the very reason that Jim said. These businesses should stand on their own. You're going to have to defend them anyway. And models, and I've done economic modeling for a lot of years. Anybody who's done any economic modeling knows that you can make a model say whatever you want it to say. So if you gussy it up by adding economic development, then you're masking some of the true cost and some of the true financial benefit, and it makes it, you start to do what I was suggesting before. You start to get sloppy on the costs. Start to get sloppy on the harder things that you have to really pay close attention to. So, I'd love to say, look, everything, it always works everywhere, and because we are adding every home's value is increased by $2,500 or $5,000. It leads
Doesn't
to
pay the bills.
Right.
Doesn't pay the bills.
And you'll get in trouble when you make those kind of assumptions and you don't have a way to show them.
That's true. We have to now have only 2 minutes for questions.
Take the question.
Any questions from anybody? Oh, Deb, you really have control of this group. It's amazing.
We are overtime, and so folks are saying, wait a minute. So if you don't mind, I'm going to wrap up while you all sit here.
Great.
First,
Listen, thank you guys.
please
Wonderful panel.
thank these folks. And I'm hoping that they'll be at the reception, so you'll be able to ask them your questions directly. I want to say thank you to our sponsors. I am really pleased that Crown Castle sponsored us today, as did the Internet